Welcome back, everyone. This is Chase, and joining me today is Colin Berg, the brand historian at Eddie Bauer. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
It's great to talk to you. This has been a conversation that's I've wanted to have for a long time, because when we talk about company archives, Eddie Bauer's is one that comes up routinely, and so it was about time that we got you on to be a part of our History of Gear series that we've been doing here on the podcast. But as you know, the earliest when I started getting into archiving and talking with companies about their collections, Eddie Bauer was one of those that always came up. It seemed like everyone knew that Eddie Bauer had a really great collection, and had a really conscious effort around preserving its history. And I kind of want to get into that today. It's like, where did this reputation come from? And I'm assuming a lot of it goes back to you. But we'll get into that. So I wanted to take a step back first of all and just understand how did you get into the outdoor industry? What was your first introduction to working in this industry?
Well, I mean, it starts with just personal interest. I've always loved the outdoors in varying things. From when I was younger, did some backpacking, and when I was in college, I hitchhiked around the country a lot and dovetailed that with some backpacking trips in Big Sur and those kinds of things. And then my wife and I moved to the Pacific Northwest in the late 1980s. And I was freelance writing at the time, or was an aspiring freelance writer. And when we first moved up here, in order to supplement that meager income, I took a job with Eddie Bauer in their call center, which at the time was local here in the Seattle area, and took orders on the phone over the Christmas holidays that year. And so that was my first exposure to the brand, and was really, I mean, I was familiar with their catalog as a consumer and so forth, but was really impressed with the unconditional lifetime guarantee that had been part of the brand ethos from its beginnings, and was still, this was in the 1980s. But that was just a 6-month temporary gig, and then when it was over, I went off and did other things. And, was freelance writing, and then was doing in-house creative services writing for different companies. And then in the mid-90s, I had an opportunity I got hired by Eddie Bauer as a writer. And so for about 10 years was on the writing staff, became a copy manager, and for the last 5 years I was the copy director. And it was that's how I actually became involved with the archives, sort of tangentially initially, just as a writer, as a storyteller. Essentially, the old stories that, you know, not only of the brand, but of the historic expeditions the company had outfitted, and, you know, just the human drama and human interest of those stories and of those old garments that were in the archives. And there was a archivist on staff. She was actually an executive administrative assistant, and one of her duties was coordinating the archives. And so I got her to come and do talks to the writing staff, just to sort of expose them, to indoctrinate them to some of the brand ethos and so forth. And then she was laid off during one of the reduction in forces that the company went through in some of its ups and downs, economic ups and downs. And so I inherited the keys to the archives, which was a storeroom in the basement at the time. And then that was my initial entrance into it. And then said ups and downs and then. So that's a sort of a meandering answer to your first question.
Well, what do you happen to know what the origins of the collection was prior to your involvement? It sounds like there was a collection, or at least there was a closet where old
Yeah,
stuff
there's
was put. But what how did that start? Do you happen to know?
well, as far as we can tell, and we have some email documentation from back in the late 1980s, where by that point, the company was, just a family-owned business into the 60s. And then Eddie and his son sold their share of the business to their two partners in 1968. And then those two men sold their share to, they sold to General Mills in the early 70s. And from that point on, it became a much more corporate structure. But through not only through those family-owned business era, but even the first 20 years of the corporate history of the company, it was really a family of employees. So there were a lot of employees that had been here for 20, 30, 40 years and stuff like that. And so it was a really close-knit group. Well, by the mid to the late 1980s, people were starting to realize, hey, we've now been in business for 60 plus years, so we've got a lot of old stuff, and we should probably start to try to organize it in some sort of way instead of just having piles of things in the corner of people's offices and stuff. So this memo went out saying, listen, we're going to start an archive. If you've got any old things that you don't need, send it to so-and-so. And these two people are going to start cataloging it and organizing it. And so that was the birth of the archives. And one of the two people that was in charge of it was this administrative assistant. I mentioned her name is Susan Knoll. And she did a fabulous job in providing the initial organization of it. And, but it was just one of a whole array of assignments that she had, duties that she had. And so the acquisition process was pretty haphazard. And so from the late 80s into the early 2000s, the archives really was just a storeroom with stuff in boxes and with a couple of 3-ring binder notebooks that had, inventory of what was there and so forth. But only very few people had any idea of what was included. Through many of the years of the catalogs, the covers were commissioned art where well-known outdoor artists would paint landscapes or wildlife and so forth like that. And part of the archive collection was and still remains some of the original paintings.
Wow.
And so the little bit that people knew of the archives were some of those paintings would be on hallways in the offices. And there were a couple of showcase windows that had an old down jacket or, that type of thing. So there were 2 or 3 pieces that were pretty well known to people. To the general associate community. But the extent of the archives was relatively unknown. And then when I was on the writing staff, as I said, I got to know Susan and had her come and give archive tours to the writers and, tell some of the stories. And so she did slideshows, this was before PowerPoint and stuff like that. So she was doing 35 millimeter slides and stuff like that, old photos and, that kind of thing. And then after she left, as I said, I inherited the archive. It was in about 2003 or so, 2002. And then in 2004, I left myself. I left Eddie Bauer. And so it kind of went into deep freezed. I mean, there wasn't really anybody else who had spent a great deal of time in there. And then in 2007, a new CEO came by the name of Neil Fisk, and he felt really strongly that a key to really revitalizing the brand was to reintegrate its past and that rich heritage and that rich history with its vision going forward. And the key part of that he saw was this archive that he had heard about, but which was in deep storage. And at that point, the company had just or was in the process of moving from to a completely different location. So a lot of the archives was scattered around the city in different warehouse storage and stuff. So it was really disjointed. So they called me up and asked me if I would come back on a temporary basis to help them unpack and put it back together and help them, help them identify the key stories. And so I was hired on a 3-month temporary assignment to do that. And at the end of the 3 months, we were just scratching the surface, so they extended it to another 3 months, and then another 6 months, and then it eventually became a staff position. So that was in 2007. I came back on a temporary assignment, and now it's 13 years later. I was I inherited a fairly well-established and originally reasonably well-organized archive that had gotten more disorganized because it had been stored away and moved around, and so that the first 2 or 3 years I was here, it was really kind of like assembling or getting ready to assemble a jigsaw puzzle, where you start spreading out the pieces. First of all, determining what's there. And a lot of the pieces I was aware of, I was familiar with from having worked with Susan in the archives in the past. Some of the stuff, and especially some of the more esoteric details, I had never seen before, and nor some of the interrelationships of how they connected. Or there was, I don't know if every city has these things, but Seattle has some of these bridges to nowhere on the highways, where a construction project starts and then somehow, I don't know, loses its funding or something, and there's just sort of something that just sort of stops and it's just hanging out there. Well, there was a lot of that stuff where these storylines would start, like an expedition or some sort of a development would start, and then there would just be these gaps where it would suddenly stop, or tangentially there'd be something else that was sort of related but not that well connected. And so a lot of the early work that I was doing was, again, assembling, really getting a clear inventory of what the pieces were, and then starting to make the associative connections that as I started reading we've got notebooks from some of the old expeditions where there's communication, memos or letters. This is before the days of email. Letters between the company and the expeditions and so forth. And reading some of that material, suddenly made connections where we had this old photograph that was labeled one place, maybe Antarctica, and it turns out it wasn't Antarctica all in all. It was Makalu in Himalaya or something like that, or vice versa kind of thing. And you start making these connections and putting things together. So it was really kind of a detective work sort of thing. It was fascinating, and just seeing how the stories emerged. It was a dream come true, really, for somebody. For me, my background as a writer, as a storyteller, I was basically given the keys to a century of great stories, and the freedom to explore them and pursue them and to go down every rabbit hole and labyrinth to see where it all took us. And so it's been a fun ride.
Do you feel like your background and your skill set as a storyteller equips you in a different way, or had prepared you in a different way, or allows you to look at the archive in a different way than maybe someone else? Not saying any is right or wrong, but I imagine your storytelling background really influences how the collection is not only preserved or viewed, but how it's accessed or used by the company.
Definitely. And I mean, and it's important to note, as you said, that it's not that there is a right way or a wrong way. And I know that if I were to give a tour of the archives to somebody who was, classically trained as a archivist or as a museum curator, they'd probably blanch at some of the things we've done or that I've done, with the archives or how we've preserved them. But for it, as it turns out, my background as a writer and I have a love of history. My dad was an amateur history buff, and when we traveled from Southern California, where we lived, to Minnesota, where my grandparents and where my family was from, I think we stopped at every historical marker between Southern California and Minnesota in the course of my childhood, and so the whole Western migration, the pioneers, became this living, breathing thing for me as a child. And so that love of history and love of story certainly reached its fruition in this position. And I think certainly happily for me and happily for the company, as it turns out, that the CEO, who was this great champion of resurrecting the archives and animating it, shared that orientation of, he was really interested in articulating and clarifying the Eddie Bauer story and how the individual stories, Eddie's story, his wife Christine's story, their collective story, all the stories of the mountaineers and all the outdoor adventures that the company has been associated with, how that, and the story of the 100 years of customers that have come to us from all sorts of walks of life. That was really the company's interest, is the stories. And so to have a storyteller be the one building out the archives really fit. Now, if I wasn't a storyteller, if I had been like a classically trained archivist, it would in a somewhat different way, and I'm sure it would be just as good, probably better in some regards, although some other things wouldn't have been. I mean, it's every situation is unique, and when you mentioned Val at Patagonia, when she and 3 other people from Patagonia came up to visit us to see the archives, they spent a couple of days. And I explained to them that our orientation was really, we use the archives as a vehicle to tell the Eddie Bauer story, and also to use it as a reference library, especially for the product developers, but really for the whole company. And as we expand our relationship with vendors and licensees, for example, whenever we have new relationships with companies, they send reps out and give them tours and stuff, because to really understand the ethos of a brand, it really helps to be able to see 100 years of that brand, and not just the current marketing platform. And so
Right. I think that's an interesting point that we should dwell on for a minute. The fact that Patagonia came to you,
right,
to ask, how do you build an archive, or at least look at what had been done at the company. And I admire that, that you and the company was willing to share. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with this initiative, is whether materials end up here at the university housed and protected, or it inspires the efforts that we're engaged in help inspire a company to go and establish an archive, that's great. Like we're all about helping solidify the place of these companies and this industry as a whole in history. And so I admire that, and that's a point that I don't want people to hear and gloss over, the fact that you were an instrumental part in helping inspire that or help them establish that. Have you had more of those conversations with other archivists or companies that aspire to establishing their own collections?
Yeah, REI came to us just much more recently. They were in the process of moving their corporate headquarters, which now with COVID, their plans have changed again. But as part of their move to a new center, they were going to significantly expand and really kind of formally establish an archive. And one of their staff had previously been at Bauer, and in fact had been the instrumental visual designer who helped lay out the Eddie Bauer's archive display room just before she left Eddie Bauer. And so she was instrumental in bringing a team from REI to Eddie Bauer as well, and I gave them a couple of tours and talked to them as well. And again, I would tell them sort of our approach and why we did it the way we did it, not with the idea that they should do it the Eddie Bauer way, but that they should find, the truth is that every company has to decide, first of all, what they need and want from the archive, and then to build it out in support of that. But archives, corporate archives, in my opinion, especially with archives of iconic brands like Eddie Bauer, like REI, like Patagonia and North Face, are becoming as the decades pass. And Pendleton people have been through our archives, and Filson too. Obviously, it's important individually for us to preserve the history. Eddie Bauer to preserve Eddie Bauer's history, for Patagonia to preserve Patagonia's history. But it's very much like our grandparents, our parents and grandparents, as they age and leave us. If we don't sit down with them and really get the stories either recorded or written down or deeply remembered, it's very easy for that to slip away, whether it's the oral histories or the written histories and so forth. And my parents lived into their 90s, and even now, I'm on the brink of 70 myself now, and even now, after my folks have gone, there are times when I think of something I want to ask them. I can't quite remember the detail of something from our personal family history, and they're not here anymore and stuff. So, and so I think part of it was the importance, the vital importance of brand histories and archives, and why it is incumbent on those of us in this field to be collaborative and mutually supportive. Is because it's not only important for us to preserve our own personal history or our own brand's history, but to collectively, support the far memory, the cultural far memory of the culture, and so that it's as accurate as we can make it, and as rich as that history deserves. And so it's one thing to have things written down and to be able to read them, and that's certainly invaluable, but it's a completely different level of experiencing those stories when you can walk somebody through the space and show them a jacket that's 80 years old, and that 80 years ago, it was on the summit of K2 or something like that. It was worn by a guy who saved 6 people from falling 8,000 feet off a mountain, kind of thing. And those are, you sit there and you think that jacket, it was sort of, it's really amazing. And another thing that sort of an example of how the Bauer archive has been used. When Neil Fix, the CEO who came in 2007, and it really instigated the major focus of the archives in the Bauer culture. He insisted that every person who came to the corporate offices as part of the interviewing process, that they had to have an archive tour as part of their interview. And so during that 2 or 3 year period where that was the law of the land, I was doing up to 10 archive tours a week.
Wow.
So I got to know the spiel really well.
Yeah.
but what was really interesting about it was that people came away completely blown away. They come, looking for obviously looking for a job and were interested in the company, but had no idea of the depth and range of what was the ethos behind it. And so whether or not they ended up getting hired or not, they came away with, they were always, or 95% of the time, just wide-eyed and really enthusiastic about having been there and so forth. And so that's an ambassadorship that is like very few other things. And so brands that have any kind of history at all, or any kind of story at all to tell, really, it's a way of really gauging how good a match somebody is. Because if they don't resonate to something like who you really are, then it's not likely going to work out that well.
Right. Well, you've mentioned this throughout our conversation so far, but it seems like from the top, it seems like a lot of these collections get started from the top, right? There's got to be buy-in from the top to allocate the resources, to hire someone who can spend the time and do it right. There's got to be space allocated. There's maybe got to be a budget so you can go out and buy materials and maybe bring some of these items back home. It's interesting to me. It seems like more and more that's the case. There's an interest in bringing these materials back home for a lot of brands, and each company seems to have maybe kind of a different reasons for that. For some companies, it's purely that reference library of physical products that the designers can go and back and reference, knowing that those classic styles are big drivers for the company from that perspective. But I think ultimately it seems like a lot of companies recognize that there's a currency that comes with having your history and understanding your history, and you can rely on that. And it adds a depth to the brand, right? If you're telling that story authentically, and people see that, and you kind of illustrated that with potential employees, candidates coming through and seeing the richness of the history of Eddie Bauer and its contributions, not only to the industry, but there's so many national, international connections that the company has. I think that's really interesting to me, as more and more companies are recognizing that history has power in a lot of different ways, and not always just from that, a revenue perspective, right? There's something to having that richness of a brand that, and there's not that many 100-year-old brands out there, right? And a lot of these outdoor companies are hitting these milestones, 50 years, 60 years. There's only a couple 100-year-old outdoor brands, but like you said earlier, it's really easy, even for some of these brands that have been around for a long time, it's easy for people to forget how old they are and how significant the impacts have been, within the industry, culturally. And so there really is significant value in people like you, as well as other archivists and other storytellers out there, to continue to tell the story of these brands. and their impacts. And I've noticed that in the collections that we're building, it is so easy for not only the big brands, but the smaller brands to just disappear from memory. Because some of these smaller brands that maybe got acquired or died out, who speaks for them, right? And that's kind of where I've been spending a lot of my time. And I've mentioned this example on quite a few podcasts, so listeners will probably be tired of hearing it, but I figured it might be interesting for you. In the early Summit magazine catalogs that we have, I've flipped through and looked at the ads, and you see some of the classic brands, the Jerry's, the Whole You Bars. And right next to them in the 50s, 60s, there's a company called Bud Davis Packs. And I have searched online. I have tried to look everywhere possible. I've asked people who are even connected to the Pacific Northwest and been involved in the industry up there, and no one seems to have any memory of this company. And so that to me, that's really interesting. A company that is right there next to Jerry and Whole You Bar, that I think that both are kind of having a revival right now, or have long histories that are pretty well documented, not completely. Another company right next to them is quickly disappeared from memory, right? And so that's the value of people like you who tell stories and document things and put them online so that people can access them and find them, and those memories can live on. So I don't know if you have thoughts there, but that's where this work has really resonated with me.
Well, actually, I do have an anecdotal about Bud Davis Packs, actually.
Oh, that's great. You're the first that I've heard. So,
and I can't remember off the top of my head which of the expeditions it was. But a lot of times different on some of these early expeditions, I mean, there would be a gear coordinator or somebody who was responsible for getting either all of the equipment or some parts of it. And on this particular expedition, the guy who was responsible for, or who at least had lobbied for the packs, they'd chosen Bud Davis Packs and the group had huge problems with the packs all the way up the mountain and stuff. And their favorite conversation was swearing at the packs and swearing at the guy who had made them bring these packs all the way up and down the mountain. And I'll see if I can find the reference and get more specifics on it. So as I recall, it was a Seattle company.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But if that was the case, I mean, if that expedition's experience with those packs was indicative of how it was performing in other situations, it's probably not surprising that it was a relatively short-lived.
Right. Yeah, no, those are, and I think it's interesting that it's been so difficult to track down any reference of those companies. But to me, I mean, there's valuable stories to be learned, whether you're a 100-year-old company that's still in existence or a blip on the radar of the history of the industry, right? And so it's been interesting to try to track that down. But I think a good lesson learned, right? It's like those materials, this memory and collective memory can easily be lost if we don't put material in a form where it can be accessed and utilized.
Yeah, and another aspect of that, especially relative to the outdoor industry, and certainly we've seen it at Bauer with mountaineering, you're building gear and apparel, but gear, when I say gear, I don't mean just packs and bags and stuff like that, but parkas and all the sleeping bags and everything, tents. You're building equipment that people are going to use in the most extreme conditions, where the difference of success and failure can be a matter of life and death. Then whether or not it's built by Eddie Bauer, who's been fortunate enough to be in business for 100 years, or Bud Davis, who I'm not sure how long they were in business, or any of the other companies, it's in many ways, in this industry, it's a collective evolutionary process. It's not just about, isolated individual brands, even those that have maintained a high level of performance consistently. Nobody is developing in isolation. Um, and I know that our guide and athlete team, many of whom are world renowned in terms of in their fields, they talk when they go to climb Everest. They talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, on the generations before who climbed those Himalayan mountains when there weren't fixed ropes and there weren't established routes and there weren't 100 Sherpas carrying their loads and all that kind of stuff, and professional guides and so forth. And the same thing is true in terms of product development, that whether or not maybe those Bud Davis packs didn't, or maybe they were crap at that particular time, on that particular expedition. But the evolution and refinement and continual improvement of the gear is a collective effort. Mm-hmm. Regardless of what brand it is, and the things we learn, the things that seem to make sense on the design table have to really be proven at 20,000 feet on the slopes of some mountain. And what makes sense in Seattle doesn't necessarily make sense on Everest, or what we think is going to survive, even if it survives on Rainier as a testing ground, it maybe won't survive in Himalaya. And so to get either overly arrogant or overly humiliated or overly judgmental about a success or failure, really misses the point. It's kind of like you talk to mountaineers who have climbed these 8,000ers and so forth. I mean, they don't, while it's always the goal to reach a summit, the success or failure of the expedition isn't determined really by whether or not they reach the summit. It's whether or not they pushed the limits and reached as far as they could. And then when they're faced 500 feet below the summit, when they're faced with a decision of, do they have enough reserves? Do they have enough energy? Do they have enough time to get back down safely? Or is it time to turn around and go back? And to have the clear thinking at high elevation to realize that in order to save yourself, you need to go back down. Especially in like a retail outdoor industry where it's really easy to get caught in this silo of its each individual brand and so forth. And so another great value of the historical record of archives is that archivists, brand historians, have a little more latitude in being a little more holistic and inclusive in thinking, hopefully. And so the preservation of the history isn't just about the individual brand, but the success of mountaineering gear in general, the amazing things that they build, how incredibly lightweight and durable, waterproof, and all these different things that they can do now, is in part because those Bud Davis packs fell apart on this expedition in the 1950s. And so whether or not the company is still in business or not, it's not fair to just write somebody off as an insignificant blip. From another perspective, we're all insignificant blips. So.
Yeah, right. Well, I think that's where this idea of stitching together the overall history of the industry it's a tall order, and I'm grateful that people like Dr. Rachel Gross are tackling that, right? Yeah. And I know you've worked with Dr. Gross before, and that's kind of the next stage of this, right? I think to have researchers, historians, to take a step back. A lot of us are so in what we're doing that we have a hard time looking at the larger picture and recognizing the larger impacts of the industry or certain companies on the industry and the rest of society. And so that's where the work of Dr. Gross, I think, is really impactful and really interesting. She's really helped open my eyes to how old this industry really is. I think for a lot of people, maybe people who are newer to the outdoor industry, they think, well, the outdoor industry was, really started in the 60s and 70s, right? Yeah, maybe that's where it really picked up. But, the L.L. Beans, the Eddie Bauers, the Abercrombie and Fitches of the world, right? At the turn of the century. And even before that, I know Dr. Gross's work focuses on Civil War onward, kind of this modern era of the outdoor industry. I don't know. There's something significant to recognizing your place in a larger context. It makes you look at the work that you're doing slightly differently. I don't know. Any thoughts on that? I just think her work is so impactful, and it changes the way that I look at my place within the outdoor industry. Considering how old it really is, how old and how young at the same time.
Yeah, it makes me think of it's actually, I've been a student of Tai Chi for 45 years, and there's a principle in Tai Chi called opening to one's place in the circle, and it has to do with breaking down adversarial, competitive relationships by conceptually changing the shape of the connections from straight line back and forth, which tend to be push, pull kind of thing, to thinking of all relationships as a circle. And so opening to our place in the circle changes. So like the example, of Rachel's relationship in a wide view of things and seeing our place in a wider perspective. It's like if all the individual brands, while staying, while holding true to their own ethos and their own perspectives and tending to their own needs, could consistently or more consistently open to each of our places as the circle of connection, of whether or not it's the circle of the outdoor industry or whatever it might be. You can make the circle as large or as small as necessary. It changes the dynamic of how we interrelate. It opens avenues of connection so that when Patagonia approaches us. Now, Patagonia approached us in terms of the archives because one of our executives used to be an executive of Patagonia, so they had an inside connection. But there isn't any reason why competitors can't share certain kinds of information. And just understanding where the places are that we can share, and where we can collaborate, and where we necessarily need to be to hold the secrets secret, and the things that aren't secret don't have to. I mean, when we get overly territorial about things that there's no reason to be. We all do this.
Well, maybe kind of a last question for you to wrap some of this up, but I guess what keeps you excited about this work? I mean, it was a 3-month temporary assignment that's turned into 13 years. What keeps you excited about this? There must still be plenty of stories to tell.
Well, it's the stories, frankly. I mean, I don't know of any form of communication and connection that's more powerful than stories. Whether or not we're telling stories to our children or to each other, it's through story that we can touch each other I mean, stories reach us at a more intimate level than almost any other form of communication. And I am continually amazed by the stories by the windows and doorways into stories and human connection that I see, in the archives. So now I'm going to be retiring within by the end of the year. So that part of my direct involvement will end, but I'll be telling stories the rest of my life, I'm sure.
Well, with that said, what's the future of the archive? You are not the archive. There will be an archive after you, but I guess what's the future of the collection?
Well, that's going to be the subject of many conversations over the next year. And we've begun preliminary conversations about that. But that will be for the company and other people to decide.
Well, great. I appreciate you being generous with your time and the theme of sharing, whether it's sharing lessons learned of how to build an archive with other companies or with us. The work that you do is so impactful. And again, I have to mention that your the reputation of the archive precedes it. I've been hearing about it for a long time, and so it's been fun for me to dive in and learn more. So I appreciate you being willing to take the time.
Well, if you're ever in Seattle post-COVID, feel free to stop by and give you a tour.
I will take you up on that. Hopefully we can get through this sooner rather than later. I would love to come up and see it.
Right.
So, well, thank you, Colin. I appreciate it. Thank you for taking time.
Yeah, thank you.